what happens when the CIA feeds LSD to a career criminal and allows him to roam free on the streets of California? Bad things happen, because, obviously. More at 11. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to The Little Lodge. Born December 12th, 1934, to a 15-year-old Kathleen Maddox, Charles Manson did not have an easy early life. Most importantly, despite the fact that his father left before he was born, his mother was a 15-year-old alcoholic, and his stepfather, well, he was fine. He was okay. The worst part about Charles Manson's childhood was that he was born in Ohio. Born Charles Maddox, Charles Manson would actually take his stepfather's last name and be legally adopted before his stepfather eventually decided to divorce his mom due to her problems of alcoholism, child abuse, the fact that she was only 15, and a number of other issues. But their marriage would only last a few years, leaving Charlie with basically no father figure. Now, why is that? Well, it's because his actual biological father, whose name, I kid you not, was Colonel Walker Henderson Scott. He was not a colonel. His name was Colonel. He was a known scoundrel. He kind of was a vagrant man about town, a con man, a petty criminal. There were no redeeming qualities to this guy, and when he found out that he was going to be having a child, he dipped. He said he was going on a trip and that he'd be back, and a few months later it occurred to the young Kathleen Maddox he probably was not gonna return. So Kathleen married William Eugene Manson, who was an actual adult. He had a job. He was a legit guy. But the problem there was that Kathleen wasn't, and she had no intention of becoming anything resembling a functioning adult. For most of Charles' young life, she really did nothing but drink and party and commit petty crimes, and eventually she ended up going to prison for that. In 1939, Kathleen and her brother Luther, which for some reason that name just makes sense here, were imprisoned for robbery. Kathleen for 5 years and Luther for 10. As a result, young Charlie Manson was sent to live with his auntie and his uncle in Bel Air. And by Bel Air, I mean West Virginia. His time with his aunt and uncle isn't super well documented, but from what I can tell, it seems like it wasn't really anything special. He probably had stability for the only time in his life, because when his mother was released on parole in 1942, Charlie went back to living with her, and they moved out to Indianapolis. And seeking to give her son a better life, Kathleen Maddox made the very good decision of marrying another alcoholic, who she met in Alcoholics Anonymous, and promptly both of them stopped going. As a result of her poor parenting, Charles was actually allowed to skip school all the time. He played truant constantly. There were probably more days that Charles was not in school than that he was in school. He was probably functionally illiterate at the time, and that would not get better. But what do you do when you're a 9-year-old with 2 alcoholic parents loose on the streets of Indianapolis? You crime. Charles committed his first crime at the age of 9 when he tried to burn down his school, and then at the age of 13 he would commit his first documented crime when he robbed a grocery store. He was sent to Gibalt School for Boys, which was a Catholic-run school for delinquent youth. And as you can imagine, it was 1948. If you know anything about boarding schools for delinquent youth, prison, insane asylums, pretty much any institution in the 1940s that was state or church-run, they weren't the best environment for people who needed actual mental help. More so, they were designed to beat the indignation and the taste for crime out of you with physical violence. After leaving Gibalt, he actually went and worked for Western Union. He was basically a courier, delivering letters and whatnot. And then he kept committing petty thievery on the side to basically supplement his paychecks. Now, he of course was caught and sent to a place called Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska, which if it were anywhere but Omaha, Nebraska, I would assume was a gay strip club. For the young or emotionally sensitive in the room, I'm going to give you a quick warning. What I'm about to say may be disturbing. Charles, then in his teen years, claimed that at Boys Town he was sexually assaulted by multiple other inmates as well as perhaps a staff member, or at the very least the staff member supervised and encouraged this behavior. In 1951, he escaped, stole a car, and started driving west, attempting to reach California, but he was caught doing so. As the previous 2 times that he had been sent to a juvenile detention center for boys had worked out so well, the government decided, you know what, this is a federal crime because you stole a car and drove it across state lines, so we're going to send you to a federal detention facility for delinquent youth called the National Training School for Boys. There, for the first time, he was actually psychologically evaluated, and it was determined that the 19-year-old Charles Manson was functionally illiterate, but he did have an above-average IQ of 109. Now, that's not particularly special. You know, if you're talking about geniuses, you're talking about up in the 150s and over, but he was more intelligent than the average person. But despite his intelligence, his caseworker described him as aggressively antisocial, a condition where, while it might not have appeared obvious to the people who knew him later in his life, likely was driving everything he did. He wasn't the charismatic person he was because he liked people, it was because he was manipulating them. But as Charles was now entering adulthood, he was facing more strict punishments. He was transferred to a minimum security facility called the National Honor Camp. But his behaviors there were less than ideal. He was actually going to have a parole hearing in February of 1952, which could have seen him released from prison entirely and simply given probation, but he was caught assaulting another boy at knife point. This got him transitioned to a much more secure facility, the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. There he was caught committing 8 crimes, which 3 of them are described as involving homosexual acts. It's not super clear what those were, but based on his track record, I think we can wager a guess. This got him moved to a maximum security facility, and worse yet, in Ohio, before he was released somehow on good behavior into the care of his aunt and uncle back in Virginia. In 1955, Manson would marry Rosalie Jean Willis, and they would steal a car to drive to California, because Manson just could not stop committing crimes. This also may be the most times I've ever heard of somebody getting off for Grand Theft Auto, ever. I'm not even kidding. Manson steals so many cars. Like, so many cars. There's literally not a documented number of cars. Later on, he made money by stealing Volkswagen Beetles and turning them into dune buggies. But he did get caught with that stolen car, and as you can imagine, when you commit Grand Theft Auto, when you commit federal Grand Theft Auto, you apparently get 5 years of probation. Today, state Grand Theft Auto carries a minimum jail sentence of 16 months, and you could face up to 3 years and a $10,000 fine for your first offense, which this was not his first offense. How Charles got off with 5 years of probation for his second offense of Grand Theft Auto is beyond me. He must have been the most charismatic person ever to live. Despite the fact that he got off on this insanely light sentence for the crimes he was committing, he went and violated his probation and was sentenced to 3 years at Terminal Island in 1956, after which his wife left him in 1957 to go be with another man. Manson, not one to be stopped by, being released from prison, 2 weeks before his parole hearing, tried to escape and was given another 5 years of probation and denied parole. In 1958, he was granted parole, and within 2 months was caught pimping a 16-year-old. He was also charged with attempting to cash a forged check. It was not clear whether or not he is the one who forged the check. He claims he stole it out of a mailbox. Now, the likelihood that you would steal a forged check out of a mailbox is pretty low, and that charge was actually eventually dropped, and they only charged him with forging the check. I could not tell from the available documentation if he was charged for the prostitution as well. It seems that he wasn't. I feel like pimping a 16-year-old would probably bring a heavier sentence than what he actually got. Manson was actually given a 10-year suspended sentence, meaning that he didn't have to serve it immediately, but he would at some point have to serve his 10 years after his probation period was over. I really don't understand why they didn't just send him right back to prison, but, I'm not a legal scholar, so who knows. In something that I would imagine would only actually happen in a Hallmark movie, a woman named Leona came to the court and pleaded for Charles to be released because they were in love. And if he was released from prison, then they would marry and it would be beautiful and happily ever after. And somehow this did work, and he was released from prison, married Leona, and then went right back to pimping, including Leona. He was arrested again in June of 1960 for violating his probation in Texas. At this point, he was transferred back to Los Angeles and ordered to serve the entirety of his sentence. Now, I decided not to go in depth in this video on the time period between 1960 and 1967 when he was eventually released on parole, because it's just not really super important to what happens. But some interesting stuff did happen while he was in prison. What interesting stuff? Well, he developed a stronger relationship with his mother, he learned how to play the steel guitar from a guy named Creepy, and he hypnotized Danny Trejo. So yes, Machete was hypnotized by Charles Manson in prison. I'd say it's a small world, but that doesn't seem to do that sentence, Danny Trejo was hypnotized by Charles Manson in the 1960s, enough justice. That is an utterly absurd thing that happened. But it does appear that, contrary to his earlier actions, the more mature, about 30-year-old Charles Manson was doing better. He was not violating laws in prison, he was not constantly trying to escape, or if he was doing those things, he got better at not getting caught. As a result of his good behavior, he was granted early release with parole requirements in 1967. He was assigned to parole officer Roger Smith, who also worked at a health clinic in San Francisco. And seeking to help Manson get back on his feet, his parole officer went, you know what? Yeah, you can move from Berkeley to San Francisco. You can hang out at this health clinic, and you know what? Let's get you back into society. Let's have you do something useful. The National Institute for Health is running this study on this really cool new drug called LSD. You want to take a whole bunch of it and then we can just watch? And Manson said, hell yeah, sign me up. In case you were wondering if this series of experiments that Charles Manson was participating in was in fact the CIA-funded MKUltra series of experiments, yeah, it was. Manson was part of the MKUltra project. Did he know that he was part of the MKUltra project? Probably not. He thought he was just getting cool drugs from his parole officer, but he was part of MKUltra. Now, to fully make sure that you grasp what I mean when I say he was part of MKUltra, if you don't know about it, in the 1960s and 70s, the CIA was trying to figure out, could you do mind control? Now, they had tried other things like remote viewing, the men who stare at goats. And also they had theorized maybe we could drop a bomb full of female sex pheromones onto Russian soldiers and make them gay. They never tried that, but they did think about it. But what they decided to do at the end of the day was, you know what, it's really hard to test this stuff in an ethical way. How do you ethically test mind control? So what we should do is take really unstable US citizens who have just been released from prison, give them a ridiculous amount of psychedelic drugs, and then just see what happens. And so that's what they did with Charlie Manson. They just gave him and his followers, as he began to develop them, because the cult begins to form around the time he starts taking LSD. So they started feeding Manson and his followers, most of them female, heroic amounts of LSD, which, by the way, the guy who invented LSD, who was a Nazi scientist named Alfred Hoffman, even he didn't think that this was a good idea, because when the Nazis were doing the exact same thing in concentration camps, he said, you know what, this is research that should really be done by medical doctors, not SS officers, and the Nazis, basically told him to kick rocks. And then the CIA went, you know who had really good ideas? The Nazis. So Roger Smith basically said, you can have as much drugs as you want as long as I can study you, consequences be damned. And the consequences were consequential. Manson began to preach in San Francisco, usually around college campuses, homeless camps, prostitutes. If you're getting the picture here, he was picking people who were isolated socially and struggling or in bad places in life, people he could easily manipulate. He could find a way to improve their immediate surroundings without really making their lives better. He was focusing on those people. You might remember from our Heaven's Gate video that this is exactly what Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite did. They targeted people who were into New Age religion, they targeted college students who were doing drugs, and they basically went about and said, all right, what can we do here? So Manson was targeting people who were social outcasts, who were already doing drugs in college. If you were a college student in the 60s, you probably were exposed to LSD. And if some attractive guitar playing guru guy comes up to you and says, hey man, you want to do all the acid? You're probably going to say yeah, and a bunch of people did. Particularly women, who Manson claimed stuck around him due to his particularly large member. Now, what Manson was preaching along with the LSD was a new religion that was based on, again, like Marshall Applewhite, the Bible and science fiction. Now, you might remember that Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite started their whole thing after this. So Manson was not being influenced by them. They might have been influenced by Manson. And he did kind of the same thing they did. He created a theology that was self-serving, that pushed him as being some sort of special guru who was chosen by God And, you know, the reason that people followed him was because they were supposed to, because that was the plan. And he found his first follower in Berkeley before moving to San Francisco in 23-year-old Mary Bruner, who would continue to be one of his followers basically all the way through. He managed to convince her to let him live with her. Initially, he stayed with her for a couple of days. It was the 1960s. They were doing drugs. You can imagine what they were doing together. So, you know, Manson managed to convince her to make this a full-time gig, and then said, you know what, let's bring in this other woman, Lynette Fromm. She can live with us too. And that arrangement continued to be very beneficial to Manson specifically. But not just Manson, let's be very clear here. There were a lot of people benefiting from this. There was Manson, there was the CIA. Sorry, that was not it. Also the National Institute for Health. It really shouldn't be understated, though, that a lot of what was going on was possible because of the free love movement of the 1960s, where, boomers were going about and saying, our parents, the people who fought both world wars and created this world we live in and worked really hard to set up a society where we could succeed, they were doing everything wrong. What we really need to do is drugs, stop showering, and having lots of unprotected relations with each other. If you ever look around at the world and wonder how we got here, thanks, boomers. Yep. If there are any boomers watching this, we assume you're the good ones. Now, while Manson was definitely targeting women specifically, possibly because he had an easier time convincing them, due to his attractiveness and the fact that he played the steel guitar and gave them drugs, he also did target men, but the men and women that he accumulated served different roles. The men were more of his foot soldiers, whereas the women acted more as servants. And Manson seems to have developed his strategy with the help of Roger Smith, who of course was a CIA asset. Because what Manson did was give his people a whole bunch of LSD, take much less LSD himself, a much lower dose, so he remained in control, and then he would use these trips, these guided trips, to convince these people to stop seeing themselves as people, but rather slaves to him. Now, why would he be trying to do exactly this? Was it because he was a manipulative bastard? Yes. Was it also because the CIA was trying to see if this whole mind control thing could work? Absolutely. Charles Manson was not working alone. He was backed up by the US government. And by April of 1968, Manson had accumulated about 20 followers who he was dealing drugs through and with, pimping, and all of this was stuff that his parole officer was completely aware of. Now, by the way, in case you were curious, both prostitution and LSD in 1968 were illegal in California. His parole officer, I cannot hammer this home enough, Charles Manson's parole officer was supervising him as he committed crimes. The LSD use, distribution, and the prostitution all should have sent Charles Manson back to prison. The only reason he did not go back to prison in 1968 is because the federal government interfered to make sure that he got off. Over and over and over. For example, one of his followers by the name of Ruth Ann Morehouse was being arrested, and Charles tried to stop that from happening. Well, that's resisting arrest. Whether you're the one being arrested or the one trying to prevent the arrest from occurring, that is considered resisting arrest, and it is a felony in California. So, Charles Manson, being a previous felon out on parole, getting caught resisting arrest, should have been immediately shipped off back to prison. But because he was a CIA asset, he was not. He was simply granted 3 years of probation. Now, if you're keeping track of how many years of probation Manson was sentenced to, I stopped, because it's just all of them. The man basically had a life sentence of probation at this point. He was arrested again in 1968, in July, while moving from San Francisco to LA with the permission of his parole officer. Now, he was arrested because he was found in a bus that he had crashed into a ditch, sleeping naked with Mary Bruner and their infant child. And they charged him with drug possession, and then let him off because the government gave him the drugs. And at this point, you may be asking yourself, well, how many times has the government given people drugs to see what would happen? And the answer is a lot, but I'm going to pick out 3 examples for you. One of them, the Tuskegee Experiments, where in the mid-1900s, the Department of Health and Human Services went to Tuskegee, Alabama, called in a whole bunch of black men, and said, hey guys, you have like blood issues. We're going to treat it. We're going to give you some shots. You just got to keep coming back every few months for your shots, all right? We're going to feed you. We're going to treat you for free. You got this. And the people of Alabama, trusting the government, said, sure, that sounds good. And so, they brought in all of these African-American men, strictly African-American men, the Department of Health and Human Services, and they injected them with the treatment. But what's the treatment for bad blood? Well, bad blood isn't a real disease, and the treatment was syphilis. So the same department that oversees the Center for Disease Control was centering their disease control on black men in Tuskegee. And then they allowed them to walk around not treating them for syphilis, because the goal of this was actually not to treat their bad blood. Of course, the goal of this was to see how syphilis spreads when untreated in a community that has no idea it's going on. And they let that go on for about 30 years until 1972, when it was finally discovered, and those people and their families won a whole bunch of money, which they should have. But surely, Aiden, lore master, surely this is the last time that this happened. No. In fact, it had happened before, because in Boston, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is, again, part of the government, it's not under any department, it was an independent government agency. The Atomic Energy Commission went to a school. At the time, it was called a school for the feebly minded, but what that means is people with mental disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and they went there and they gave these kids trips to Disneyland, and they gave them food and gifts and injected them with plutonium. No, sorry. That was a different experiment. They gave them plutonium oatmeal to see what would happen. They injected other people with plutonium. But for that, you're going to need to look into the Los Alamos body snatchers and all that. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of stuff that went down with plutonium research in the 1900s. But now you're thinking, Aiden, surely this can't go on much longer. There's no way. Except in the 1980s, the CIA sold crack to the Crips and Bloods in LA, basically targeting exclusively the black community, and used the money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, a lot of people think, I can't believe Reagan did that. That wasn't Reagan. When this was ordered, Reagan was actually in surgery. No, this was George Bush. Now, who did George Bush, formerly, before becoming vice president, work for? The CIA. So yeah, this is a short list. If you go on Wikipedia and you just look up list of government experiments on US citizens, it's horrifying. But anyway, we're not talking about all of the many times the government has experimented on its own citizens. We're talking about a specific time the government experimented on its own citizens. And that was Charles Manson, who in 1968 moved his family out to the Spahn Ranch. Probably the Span Ranch, which had been a film set for Westerns in the 1950s and 60s. But it eventually became kind of dilapidated and decrepit, and it was too far from Hollywood itself. It was out on the outskirts of LA County, so it was rented out to Charles Manson and his family by George Spann, the then 80-year-old blind owner of the ranch. Now, what was the payment Spann got? Well, the men helped fix things up, the women helped fix him up, and that was basically the arrangement. Manson got to move his family in, and Spann got a happy ending. It might be Spawn. Aiden's in the peanut gallery researching it for me, and he says Spawn.
Based off the spelling, I wasn't sure.
Tomato. But I did kind of leave something out here. A few months before the Span Ranch thing, that was in the fall of 1968, well, in the summer of 1968, he moved out to LA, and they were kind of couch surfing, hopping around, figuring out where to go, when two of his followers, who were hitchhiking, encountered a Dennis Wilson. Dennis Wilson you may know as the drummer from the Beach Boys. Yes, that Dennis Wilson. Why are so many people involved in this story? I don't know. But Dennis brought these two girls back to his place, and then he went out to record for the night. He was having a night recording session. When he came back, he found Charles Manson in his driveway, barefoot, and asked Manson, "Do you intend to hurt me?" And Manson was like, "No, I'm going to suck your toes." And then he did. He actually kissed his feet, but I think it's funnier if he sucks his toes. Tarantino, where were you for this? It does make sense that Tarantino would focus on Charles Manson for a film with his affinity for feet. But anyway, Wilson walked inside of his own home and realized that not only were the two girls that he had brought back with him there, but then there were 10 more. And Charles Manson was basically like, "Hey, can we stay here for a little while, and I'll give you drugs and women, and you let me record some music with you?" And Dennis Wilson said, "You know what? That's a great deal." And then he got evicted for having too many people in his house. He also spent thousands of dollars on the Manson family for things like the fact that they totaled one of his cars, they needed food, they needed treatment for just so much gonorrhea. And he introduced Manson to a number of important people in the music and film industry, including one Rudy Altobelli, who owned a house that was being rented to Terry Melcher. Now, Terry will become mildly important later in the story, but you need to know about the Rudy Altobelli house because it's important. Around this time, Manson began preaching about something he was referring to as Helter Skelter. Now, Helter Skelter was a popular Beatles song of the time. The Beatles were not yet the Beatles, as we know them today. They were a cultural icon, but they were not the Beatles. Hot take, I think the Beatles are overrated. You can eviscerate me in the comments if you like, but I will not back down from that. Bob Dylan, also overrated. Now, what was Helter Skelter? Well, Manson believed that encoded in the Beatles song Helter Skelter was a story about how a race war was coming, and a race war between the blacks and the whites, and the blacks would win. But Manson, the white supremacist that he was, believed that blacks weren't intelligent enough to rule themselves, which I'm not sure how he reconciled the existence of Africa with that belief, but he somehow did, and he believed that, the blacks were going to kill all of the white people in America, but they'd need a leader. But who was that leader? An illiterate man from Ohio. So basically, Charles Manson's belief was black people would win a civil war based on race and then collectively decide to let a white guy be in charge. I don't know what he was thinking, but I think LSD had a lot to do with it. Now, to George Spann's credit, he seems to have been unaware of this, probably because he was literally blind. Now, things did begin to escalate after this, and you might see race war now as an escalation, but Manson seems to have decided to make it happen. Now, there's a number of theories here, and one of them is that everything Manson does from this point on is to kick off Helter Skelter, to start this race war. And then there's beliefs that had to do with drugs and, other things. We'll get to them. But in March of 1969, things begin to get worse. On March 23rd, Manson approached the house of Terry Melcher, which of course was owned by Rudy Altobelli. But he didn't find Terry Melcher there. He found Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, who were also there with an Iranian photographer friend of theirs, whose name was Shahrokh Hatami. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. I am trying. Tate and Hatami informed him, I was wrong, Polanski was not there. Tate and Hatami informed him that they didn't know anybody by the name of Terry Melcher, but maybe they could go around the back and check out the guest house. So Manson went around back, knocked on the guest house door, where he encountered Rudy Altobelli, who was a little put off by this and told Manson that Melcher, in fact, had moved to Malibu, but he didn't know his exact address. Probably because he could tell that whatever Manson was there for with Melcher, it was not going to go well for Melcher. So he and Altobelli had a conversation. Altobelli told him, I would say come back tomorrow and we can talk, but I'm actually leaving for Europe for like a year. He was leaving for Europe, but not for a year. He was going to be back in like a couple of weeks. And basically sent Manson off and said, by the way, can you not harass my tenants? That would be nice. The next day, Tate would go to speak to Altobelli and ask if that creepy guy from last night had stopped by. He, of course, had. Now, this is not the moment when the thing happens about this story happens. Tate actually got on a plane for Rome the next, but she would come back a few months later. Now, after this is when the murders start, because the first one seems to have kicked off the rest in a way. A man by the name of Bernard Crowe was involved in a drug deal for marijuana with a man named Tex Watson. Tex Watson, of course, was one of Manson's followers, and he was not actually intending to buy drugs or get money to buy drugs from Crowe. His goal was to rob Crowe. And if there's something you shouldn't do, it's typically rob drug dealers. They don't take kindly to that. Anyway, Tex left his ex-girlfriend with Crowe as collateral, took the money that Crowe was giving him for his share of the marijuana they were buying, and then just never came back. And Crowe was slighted by this. And he called Manson up and he said, if you don't get me my money, I'm going to come down to that ranch and kill all of you. Manson, being the impulsive person he was, said that's not good enough. And sources differ on where this occurred. Some say that it happened, on the street somewhere. Some say it happened in a club. Some say it happened in Manson's apartment in LA. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. What happened is that Manson, with a .22 caliber revolver, if you know anything about guns, you'll know that probably won't kill you, shot Crowe once. Then the next day, he heard about the body of a Black Panther being found dumped in the river, the Black Panthers being a black power group of the 1960s and 70s. Manson assumed that murdered Black Panther and Bernard Crowe were the same person. They weren't. Bernard Crowe survived and would go on to testify against Manson in 1971 and 1972. But Manson did become very concerned after this, thinking that Bernard was a Black Panther when he wasn't, that the Black Panthers would retaliate. Now, if you don't know anything about the Black Panthers, they were a militant black power group. They carried guns. They were the real deal. They were legit. They made Antifa look like a bunch of So, to preempt this attack he believed was coming, he hired the Straight Satan's motorcycle gang, who wear a 1% patch. That 1% is referring to the fact, or the general belief, that 99% of bikers are totally upstanding people, but 1% are true outlaws, and the Straight Satans wanted you to know that they were the true outlaws. Living in 2022 and doing no background research on the Straight Satans, I'm gonna assume that, for my own pleasure, that they weren't saying we're like straight up Satan, but rather that there was another club known as the Gay Satans and they were in a feud. I think that would be funny. But this gang's involvement would lead to the first actual murder committed by the Manson family, which was against a young man named Gary Hinman. He was a music teacher and a PhD candidate in music at the University of California, Los Angeles. He also created a drug called Mescaline in his basement. Mescaline is actually a naturally occurring psychedelic that you can get out of multiple species of cacti. It's not the same thing as mezcal, which is a distilled alcoholic beverage made from agave. Tequila is a type of mezcal made from specifically blue agave. But some of these Straight Satan's members decided, you know what, we're gonna buy some mescaline from this music guy. And then they decided the mescaline was not as good as they expected it to be. They accused him of selling them bad drugs and said, we want our money back. But Gary Hinman had already spent the money, and he showed them his checkbook to prove, I've spent this money. So they had to come up with another plan, and after a brief kerfuffle, they came to the conclusion that, you know what, we'll take the titles for 2 of your old cars that are worth a little bit over what we actually gave you in terms of money. But during the kerfuffle, one of the women involved in this, Susan Atkins, had called Manson and said, hey, we're having trouble, they're fighting with Hinman, like, we need help, what do we do? So, after they had come to their agreement and settled everything and decided, all right, we know what we're doing here, it's all good, Manson showed up, took out a very long, like, sword-style knife, and slashed Hinman across the face with it, cutting his cheek and also his ear. Hinman was not happy about this, and neither was Bobby Beausoleil, who was one of the Straight Satan's gang members, who actually was who was shaking down Hinman. And when Beausoleil asked, what are you doing? Why'd you do that? Manson replied, I'm showing you how to be a man. And then he promptly left, and that left Beausoleil with 2 of the women, Susan Atkins and Mary Bruner, who, as we know, was kind of Manson's chief paramour, we'll call it. So, Manson left, he went back, and left Bobby and the women there, and eventually Bobby ended up calling Manson to ask, what do I do? I can't take this guy to the hospital. He's demanding to go to the hospital. I have no clue how to handle this, because if I take him to the hospital, he's going to rat me out, which Hinman had said he would do. Which, by the way, if you're ever, like, attacked by a biker gang, and they say, if I take you to the hospital, are you going to tell the cops? Don't tell the truth. Do not tell the truth. That is a horrible idea. Tell them you're going to keep quiet, and then go into protective custody. Anyway, Hinman said, yeah, I'm going to tell the cops. So Beausoleil called Manson and said, what do I do? Manson said, you're on your own. So he stabbed Beausoleil twice in the chest, killing him. After killing Hinman, Bobby Beausoleil tried to make the scene look like a political hit. They burned some Marxist literature, wrote some stuff like political pig on the walls and floor, and just generally made the crime scene look something like what, I don't know, the Black Panthers might do. Now, why would the Black Panthers be targeting an ostensibly also progressive Marxist musician? We're not talking about the most intelligent of people here. It's also important to note that while Susan Atkins and Mary Bruner did not actually stab Hinman, they did help cover up the crime. And it's at this point in the story that we get to the point where most people will recognize the events. Now, for a lot of people, that is because of the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is one of Quentin Tarantino's, and one of the ones where he makes you look right at somebody's feet for an awkward period of time. Tarantino, my guy. Why? On August 8th, 1969, a group of people, including Tex Watson, as well as 3 women from the Manson family, approached the home of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski at 10050 Celio Drive, Los Angeles. Upon approaching the house, Tex Watson ran into Stephen Parent and promptly shot him, killing him. Stephen was actually not a friend of Sharon Tate. He was a friend of the house's caretaker hired by Rudy Altobelli. Tex, as well as Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel, entered the house where they would find Jay Sebring, Sharon Tate, Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail Folger. Those 4 people. Of course, they had already killed Stephen Parent. Now, when they got there, Tex would utter the words, "I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business," which in his head probably sounded a lot cooler than it did when it was said. And while later in his trial he would talk about how it was fun tearing up the Tate household, people were running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Actual quote, he laughed while he said it. I kind of believe there must have been a moment where people kind of gave him like a, huh? Because honestly, that makes the whole thing warm my heart a little bit more, that this guy probably really just seemed like a total nutcase, and at least, hopefully was humbled somewhat. Now, one detail that adds to the tragedy a little bit here is the fact that Sharon, then aged 26, was actually 8.5 months pregnant. So, in my opinion, Tex should have been charged for 6 murders. There actually is a precedent for charging the murder of a pregnant woman as a double homicide, and that should have been the fullest extent of the law at that point. The murders actually began around 12:30 a.m. on August 9th, 1969, and one thing that has always been unclear is the level of participation of the women. Were they there as backup? Were they there to make sure Tex actually did it? Manson's motives seem very unclear in many of these cases, especially considering that later on, he would insist in his trial that the women had no part in the murders. They were just there, which is not how murder works, because you could be charged as an accomplice or an accessory simply for not reporting it, let alone helping. So we don't know if Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel actually killed anybody. It was claimed that Kasabian didn't, and she actually received a different charge from everybody else when the trials came. But it's hard to say. The witness testimony from these people is utterly incoherent. It changes. It does not match. It's all designed to get Charles Manson off. And I mean, this entire cult was designed to get Charles Manson off in multiple ways, so that's not even the point here. Regardless of whether or not they actually did anything, one thing that is clear is the women did have orders to follow any directions Tex gave them. Now, in this case, it seems that Tex did not give them any orders to hurt anybody, but probably to act as backup, so to speak. Now, the very next day, in fact, the same day that the murders were committed, because this happened the night of August 9th, Manson went to a house himself. He went to the LaBianca household and cased it along with 6 companions. Those included Tex, Linda, Susan, and Patricia, as well as Steve Grogan and Van Houten? Something Van Houten? Leslie Van Houten. Lonnie and Rosemary LaBianca don't seem to have any further connection to this case that I could discover. Now, it may be that I just didn't find it in my research, but this one seems pretty random to me. Obviously, these were all very wealthy people, but it doesn't seem like Manson had had previous encounters with them as he had with the Tates and with Hinman. Manson, after casing the house himself, would eventually come back down the hill and dispatch Tex Watson, as well as Leslie Van Houten, and after casing the house, Manson would come back down the hill and send Tex Watson up, as well as Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel. They had orders, again, to follow whatever Tex told them to do, and what Tex told them to do in this case was kill somebody. While Tex stabbed Mr. LaBianca, I believe his name was Lonnie, the other 2 were tasked with killing Rosemary LaBianca, but she was swinging a lamp at them and fending them off pretty well, so Tex, after stabbing Mr. LaBianca with a bayonet 12 times, entered the other room where the women were and proceeded to stab Mrs. LaBianca and then insist that both the other women stab her as well. Following this, they would write several phrases on the walls and the refrigerator. On the refrigerator, you had Helter Skelter, which was the name of a recent Beatles song that no matter how many times I read the lyrics, I do not understand how Charles Manson, other than the influence of the LSD, came to believe that this was, in fact, some sort of coded message about race war. I can't even figure out what the song is about at all, let alone race war. It just seems like nonsense, which is most Beatles lyrics. So, sue me for that if you want. Aside from Helter Skelter, Patricia Krenwinkel also wrote the words "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the wall, which seems to follow this line of anti-cop language, but these weren't cops. None of these people were police officers. So why were they writing this? I mean, it's a very simple answer. A lot of people are going to look into the conspiracies about it and, come up with all those sorts of different things. These weren't intelligent people. The only intelligent person here was Charles Manson. As we know, Charles Manson was only slightly above average intelligence. So really, what's going on here is you've got a bunch of stupid people hopped up on LSD who think that they're starting a race war. And that's the only way to understand anything that's going on. Now, had it been any more complicated, I would say that the CIA was giving them directions, but it really seems like the CIA's aim in this entire experiment with MKUltra was to see if they could get mind control to happen and then totally ignore all of the consequences. And perhaps the most frightening thing about this is that the CIA really did get what they wanted. They proved that you could do mind control. It was going to be a lot more complicated than simply looking into somebody's eyes and hypnotizing them. You were going to have to take them on multiple massive LSD trips to eventually get them to abandon all sense of self, but it could be done. It wasn't going to be done with any sort of magic or electromagnetic pulses going through your brain. It was going to be essentially psychedelic-induced hypnotism, but you could do it. This was, however, the last of the Manson family murders under the direction of Charles Manson himself. And to this day, nobody has been able to completely understand the motive. There are several theories. Vince Bugliosi, who was the deputy district attorney prosecuting the case, and also a complete moron who could not see a connection if it was 2 feet in front of his face, he thinks it was this whole Helter Skelter dynamic where Manson was preaching about all of these race war ideologies and this apocalyptic future where the blacks were going to eliminate the whites, and then because he was a white supremacist, he thought that they wouldn't be smart enough to... He thought they would be smart enough to kill a population much larger than their own, but not smart enough to run their own government. Mind-boggling lack of intelligence on Manson's part here. But he thought that, he was going to be their new god, that they were going to appoint him the ruler of their new nation, even though he preached about how stupid they were. It is beyond me how Manson could have these. It's got to be the LSD. Don't do drugs, kids. And if you do drugs, don't do them with charming, attractive, steel guitar playing hippies from LA. Don't do anything with charming, attractive, steel guitar playing hippies from LA. That's probably just not going to go well for you. So while Vince Bugliosi did heavily believe in the Helter Skelter narrative, his own detectives didn't. His detectives thought of 2 far more mundane possibilities. One of them was that this was all a cover-up for the Hinman murder. Bobby Beausoleil was in custody, so if these murders that were basically carbon copies and escalations of the Gary Hinman murder, Bobby Beausoleil could not be responsible for them. So maybe they had the wrong guy, and this would throw them off the Manson trail entirely, because while they weren't totally investigating Charles Manson, they were aware of the arrangement between the Straight Satans and the Manson family at Spahn Ranch. So to them, it was, we've got a series of stabbings and a couple of gunshots, and that is what happened with Hinman, and we've got the word pig written in blood, that happened with Hinman, and this seems to have been a targeted hit, that happened with Hinman. So it makes sense that this could be a cover-up or copycat murders. Finally, there was the possibility that this was all just a drug deal gone wrong. There were beliefs that perhaps Manson had sold them bad drugs and gotten beaten up for it, much like Bobby Beausoleil beat up Hinman, and that this was a revenge killing. It was also possible that Manson had been slighted, that they had underpaid him or tried to avoid paying him, and this was his retribution. And there's the fact that Joel Rostow, who was Jay Sebring's receptionist's boyfriend, sold them drugs earlier that day. Again, it was mescaline, so another tie-in to the Hinman murder. The detectives seem to have been very aware that the Hinman murder and the LaBianca and the Tate murders all had a lot in common. Why Vince Bugliosi decided not to investigate this is beyond reasonability. At any case, when they started investigating the Tate murder, it wasn't connected to the LaBianca murder. There were whisperings that maybe it had to do with the Hinman case, but nobody took that seriously either. All 3 cases were investigated separately. Now, part of the reason that the Tate murder and the LaBianca murder were not immediately connected was because when they discovered the Tate bodies, they did not discover the LaBianca bodies. That didn't happen until much later on the 10th. So, nobody even knew there was a connection to be made yet. And the autopsies for the Tates were underway when the bodies of the LaBiancas were discovered by their son. While the LaBianca bodies were discovered at 10:30 p.m. on August 10th, a statement was released on August 12th by the LAPD stating that they did not believe that there was any connection between these cases. This is primarily because at the time it seemed that the Tate case was drug-related and the LaBianca case simply had no drug involvement whatsoever. But on August 16th, Spahn Ranch was raided, and you might be thinking, well, they made the connection. The Tates, the LaBiancas, the Straight Satans, Gary Hinman, it's all coming together. But no, nobody had any clue that Manson was related to this. What they were raiding Spahn Ranch for was automotive theft, because if you remember from the very beginning of this story, Manson really liked automotive theft. And what they were doing was stealing Volkswagen Beetles, taking them out to their ranches, turning them into dune buggies, and then selling them for a massive profit, because of course they didn't have to buy into the dune buggy in the first place. A lot of these vehicles were actually being stashed in Death Valley National Park, and that's how the National Park Service weaseled its way into this video. That's right, the National Park Service was involved in one of the Manson raids. Now, of course, once they raided Spahn Ranch, they actually had Manson on a concrete crime that they could nail him for, they could put him away. This was Grand Theft Auto to the max. This was dozens of counts of Grand Theft Auto. He could go away for life just based on that. But Charles Manson was a CIA asset. So Charles Manson was let off, as well as his entire group of followers, for a misdated warrant. Now, the LAPD, they couldn't know how deep this really went. So when Manson was let off, they probably believed, it really was just a misstated warrant, let's get the right warrant, and then let's go back and do the raid again. And that is precisely what they would do. But first, at the end of August, detectives did connect the LaBianca case to the Beatles. They thought this had to do with the Helter Skelter thing because, Helter Skelter was written in blood on the refrigerator. So, is it possible that the LAPD knew that Charles Manson had been preaching this whole Helter Skelter thing? It's possible. I also couldn't find confirmation of it. If they had known that, I think they would have immediately gone after him because it would have been so obvious, or at least obvious that one of his followers was involved. And if his followers were involved, there's a good chance he might be. Now, this case essentially went stale in terms of forming connections and, of course, finding a murderer because they hadn't figured out it was the Mansons yet, until October of 1969, when they finally, on the 19th of October, began looking for similar crimes to the LaBianca case. And the crime they found was, as you would expect, the Hinman case, because why would you connect two identical murders that happened within 24 hours of each other? Great police work, guys. Fantastic job. And at this point, they finally do arrest Manson. But it's still not for the murders, it's for the automotive theft. Now, Manson at this point had kind of spread his followers out. They weren't all at Spahn Ranch, they were at Spahn and two other ranches. And he was found at one of them, hiding in a cupboard by a highway patrolman. Because at no point in this story does law enforcement do anything that makes sense. The National Park Service was involved in the raid, Highway Patrol was involved in the raid, LA County Sheriff was involved, LAPD was involved. There were so many different police departments doing this, and honestly, if the FBI had just stepped in and done their job, it was the federal government that's responsible for this. Never mind. And after arresting Manson and having him in custody, the detectives finally did make, and it might not be that they finally did, it might be that Bugliosi finally allowed them to make this connection. They finally connected the LaBianca and Tate murders. And that was done via the Straight Satans. The LaBianca detectives were looking at the Hinman case, they knew the Straight Satans were involved in that, and the MO between the Hinman and the LaBianca case matched, and then they looked at it and said, all right, well, the MO between these two cases and the Tate case matches, and there was Mescaline involved in the Tate case and the Hinman case, but not the LaBianca case, so we've got a lot of connections here that can't be a coincidence. And they finally decided they had their answer. This revelation blew the case wide open. Manson and 3 of his companions were all sentenced to death. A number of others were sentenced to much more minor charges. And Tex Watson, who had fled to Texas at this point, because of course he did, was eventually extradited back to Los Angeles, tried separately, and finally also sentenced to death. None of them, except for Manson, showed any remorse. Manson claimed to have not been involved, and they actually backed him up. They were perfectly willing to lay their own lives down for Charles Manson, a man who had done nothing for them but give them drugs, prostitute them, and use them as slave labor. So, moral of the story, the CIA's mind control experiment really worked well. Like, it worked really well. Terrifyingly well. And I mean, that's, I guess, a silver lining for somebody here, but it also is important to note that every single person who died, went to prison, had their life ruined, all of that, every single person involved in this here, it happened because of the CIA experimenting on American citizens. That's the moral of the story here. That's the real creepy thing about the Manson murders, because if you look at them, even if you dig in with the Mansons, there's not much conspiratorial. The cult didn't have any coherent ideology. It wasn't like Heaven's Gate. There was no real attempt at creating Helter Skelter. There was no grand scheme to devise this race war. Manson was essentially a rambling madman with a following of drug-addicted young women who worshipped him because he was good-looking. It's horrifying, the entire thing, but there's nothing special there. What's special is this is concrete proof of what the CIA has been doing to Americans. It's what they killed Kennedy for. It's what they did countless other horrible things for. In order to fund the Contras in Nicaragua to prevent communism from getting to South America, they sold crack to black people. I mean, it's the number of problems that have been caused directly by the CIA is horrifying. But at least they got Manson. And he was sentenced to death, but then California decided that they couldn't stomach the death penalty and got rid of it, so he just died in prison at 83 in 2017. That's really where this video ends. That is the bulk of this story. There's a lot more that happens. For example, Lynette Fromm, one of Manson's followers, attempted to assassinate Jimmy Carter. There were a slew of revenge killings in the 1970s, and by the 80s, it all kind of died down, but, they were really trying for a little while there, and the conviction of Manson seems to have been what set them off. Needless to say, it's for the best that all of these people are either dead or spending the rest of their lives in prison because their minds seem to have been warped beyond all recognition by LSD. But, it's still a complete and utter tragedy that any of this happened, and it didn't need to. But that does bring us to the end of the story. If you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, please check us out on Patreon. You can support us for just $1 a month. We're trying to up our production scale and our quality. We'd love to do more Into Thin Air videos where we go on site to investigate missing 411 cases, talk to the people who were there, and try and understand the real story, not the one pitched by David Paulides or the one pitched by the federal government, but the truth that lies somewhere in between. And if you want to support us in other ways, we have an Amazon storefront that you can check out. We also have a partnership with Target. I am wearing Target clothes right now. They're very comfortable, and can you even tell that they're from Target? No, you can't, because they're high quality. They're nice. They're flashy. I look good. You look good. We're all going to be happy people. Anyway, we also have a coffee that I am drinking, not that right now because I decided to have espresso this morning, but we do have a coffee. It's Mount Pocono Perk. It is a medium dark roast that I designed to be basically, a nostalgic hot cup of coffee on a mountainside on a misty morning kind of vibe. I think it turned out well. Aiden, how do you think it turned out?
I think it turned out very well, and I think you should also remind them that it is the whole bean.
Oh, yeah.
So they could make it espresso if they wanted.
That's true, yes. You can get our coffee in whole bean or ground for whatever purposes you like. But if you have an espresso machine at home, you can get this whole bean and grind it for espresso, and then you can make yourself a nice latte with Mount Pocono Perk. Mount Pocono Perk by Tableau Roasting Co. Mount Pocono Perk. Have I said Mount Pocono Perk enough times?
I think you've said enough to reach the tipping point at which people will remember that it is Mount Pocono Perk by Tableau Roasting Co.
Okay, good. I appreciate that. Anyway, that about does it for today. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.